10-10 wins. You give us 22 minutes, we'll give you the world.
Congestion heading up towards the Manhattan Bridge and again en route to the Kosciuszko.
It's loaded up coming down from Queens from the LIE down to the Kosciuszko Bridge.
Every week, 1 million cars squeeze over a bridge between Brooklyn and Queens. Traffic reporters struggle with the tongue-twisting name. But who was he? Thaddeus Kosciuszko was a Polish officer who fought in the American Revolution. His successful plan for the Battle of Saratoga was the turning point of the war. George Washington named Kosciuszko the architect of West Point. Benedict Arnold's act of treason was trying to sell Kosciuszko's plans for West Point to the British.
General Kosciuszko served not only a key role in the American Army, but also in the construction of Fortress West Point. Without General Kosciuszko, there would be no West Point.
Thomas Jefferson called Kosciuszko as pure a son of liberty as I have ever known, and of that liberty which is to go to all, not to the few and rich alone.
Kosciuszko was one of the eminent Europeans who came over explicitly for the purpose of fighting on behalf of the American Revolution, because he identified himself with the causes for which it stood. And that was a genuine revolution in human affairs.
Kosciuszko was a prince of tolerance ahead of his time. He left his salary from the Continental Army to purchase black slaves and free them. He championed civil rights for slaves, serfs, Jews, Native Americans, and all races. Born in Poland in 1746, Kosciuszko studied at military academies in Warsaw and Paris. He was forced to flee his home in 1775 after he tried to elope with the daughter of one of the richest men in Poland. In Paris, he read about the American Revolution. In June 1776, he set sail to volunteer for the Continental Army. He reached Benjamin Franklin's print shop in Philadelphia in August and said he wanted to take the officer placement exam. Franklin asked Kosciuszko for letters of recommendation. The Pole had none, but said he could prove his skill through the officer's test and engineering exam. The Continental Army needed educated officers who understood war tactics and strategy. But the Americans had no engineering exam, so Franklin asked him to take a geometry test. When Kosciuszko aced the test, Franklin hired him on the spot. Kosciuszko presented his credentials to Congress. While awaiting his commission, Kosciuszko designed forts on the Delaware River with underwater booby traps of logs with sharp iron tips. Franklin had finally found a professional military engineer. Congress agreed. President of the United States Congress, John Hancock, appointed Kosciuszko a colonel and engineer in the United States Army. His salary, $60 a month. Kosciuszko's expertise impressed the Americans. At first, his English was so poor that he spoke French. This led many, including George Washington, to believe that he was French.
I am informed there is a French engineer of eminence in Philadelphia at this time.
On December 20th, Washington wrote to Hancock complaining about engineers.
None of the French gentlemen whom I have seen with appointments in that way appear to me to know anything of the matter. There is one in Philadelphia whom I am told is clever, but him I have never seen.
That clever engineer was Kosciuszko. Washington wanted to hire him. But General Horatio Gates, commander of the Northern Army, had already given Kosciuszko his next job. Gates sent Kosciuszko to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York to prepare for a British invasion from Canada. Kosciuszko said the fort was vulnerable to attack from a nearby hill. He proposed putting cannons on Mount Defiance. But the fort's engineer, Colonel Baldwin, ridiculed his suggestions. Instead, Baldwin ordered his men to build blockhouses with wooden towers. Colonel James Wilkinson wrote to Gates,
"The works are now pushed on Baldwin's unmeaning plan. For God's sake, let Kosciuszko come back as soon as possible."
The Polish engineer returned with orders from General Gates to arm Mount Defiance. But General Arthur Sinclair refused to drag cannons up the 850-foot hill. it would prove to be a dire mistake. In early July, General John Burgoyne's British Army arrived from Canada and pitched camp nearby. Burgoyne's artillery chief, General William Phillips, saw the tactical advantage of placing cannons on Mount Defiance.
The general told us to drag guns up on top of that hill. We told him it was too steep. Know what he says? Where a goat can go, a man can go. Where a man can go, he can carry a gun.
On July 4th, 1777, the Continental soldiers were swilling rum, celebrating the first anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The British were nearby, preparing an assault. The next morning, woozy American soldiers awoke to cannon fire from Mount Defiance. The British set Baldwin's blockhouses on fire. The rebels were sitting ducks, and General Sinclair ordered an evacuation. He was to face court-martial for abandoning the fort. The Continental Army crept over a footbridge of floating logs that Kosciuszko built across Lake Champlain, with the British in hot pursuit. Kosciuszko led 2 brigades to cover the rear. General Philip Schuyler wrote to Kosciuszko,
I have sent a quartermaster to Saratoga and the post below to bring up all the axes which can be collected and to deliver them to you. Colonel Lewis has my orders to send you a horse immediately. I will give the orders to move General Fermoy's and General Patterson's brigades tomorrow and dispose of them in a manner you wish.
The Pole rallied 300 soldiers to delay the enemy pursuit. Kosciuszko's troops chopped down trees to block roads. They destroyed bridges after the Americans crossed and rolled boulders into streams to flood roads and trails. British supply wagons were stopped in their tracks. Lieutenant Thomas Anbury complained that the English had to wait
till the roads are cleared of the trees which the Americans felled after their retreat. Every 10 or 12 yards, great trees are laid across the road.
Because of Kosciuszko's actions, it took the British 20 days to travel only 23 miles. This allowed the Continental Army an opportunity to reorganize and to get substantial reinforcements from Washington's army and from the militias of the surrounding states.
Major John Armstrong wrote,
In the retreat of the American army, Kosciuszko was distinguished for activity and courage, and upon him devolved the choices of camps and posts and everything connected with fortifications.
General Gates ordered his troops to make a stand along the Hudson. Kosciuszko was surprised when he saw troops camped on the riverbank and told Colonel Morgan Lewis,
From yonder hill on the left, your encampment may be cannoned by the enemy, or from that on our right, they may take aim at your shoe buckles.
Kosciuszko told Gates he'd find a better spot to make a stand. He rode north and chose an elevated pasture along the river. Colonel Lewis recalled,
Kosciuszko inquired the number of divisions in the army and their names, took a piece of paper from his portfolio and drew the plan of the camp, and assigned the location of several regiments, and in conformity with that plan, they were speedily marched to the ground, and they proceeded to erect breastworks and fortifications.
The choice of Bemis Heights was probably one of the most important tactical decisions of the American Revolution.
Colonel Udney Hay wrote,
Our first step was to Stillwater, and we are now on the heights called Bemis, looking the enemy boldly in the face. Kosciuszko selected this ground and has covered its weak point, its right, with redoubts from the hill to the river.
Kosciuszko marked the American position with an A, and the British position with a B. The Americans waited for the British to fall into Kosciuszko's trap.
The Battle of Saratoga was undoubtedly the turning point of the American Revolution. Most historians agree that the United States never would have been successful without the French alliance. It wasn't until news of the British surrender at Saratoga arrived in Paris that the French agreed to an alliance and to come out openly in favor of the United States. So without Saratoga, there probably would not have been an American alliance with France. There probably wouldn't have been American independence. And of course, it was Kosciuszko who was largely responsible for the American success at Saratoga.
When the British attacked on September 19th, they tried to march around Kosciuszko's fortifications through the woods, but walked into an ambush. 600 British soldiers were killed or wounded. In the nights after the battle, British troops cowered in the dark, licking their wounds. British Lieutenant Thomas Anbury wrote,
Large droves of wolves came after the dead. They were similar to a pack of hounds, for one setting up a cry, they all joined, and when they approached a corpse, their noise was hideous till they had scratched it up.
Worried about the plague, the British planned their next move. The second attack came on October 7th. Colonel Daniel Morgan's sharpshooters outflanked the Redcoats and gunned down their officers. On October 17th, General Burgoyne was forced to surrender to General Gates. When Gates was praised for the victory, he gave the credit to Kosciuszko.
In war, as in medicine, natural causes not under our control do much. In the present case, the great tacticians of this campaign were the hills and forests, which a young Polish engineer was skillful enough to select for my encampment.
Washington realized that the British were trying to divide and conquer the colonies by capturing the Hudson River. Control of the river was crucial.
The Americans chose a spot called West Point, where the Hudson River bends. British ships traveling through would have to slow down to tack to make their turns. The Americans knew if they put a chain across the river at this point, they would block British navigation and thus control the gateway to America.
Washington had yet to meet Kosciuszko, but knew of the Pole with a strange name and suggested that he be promoted. Washington wrote,
I have been well informed that the engineer in the Northern Army, Kosciuszko, I think his name is a gentleman of science and merit. From the character I've had of him, he is deserving of notice.
A French engineer, Colonel Louis de la Radière, was at West Point, but he did not get along with the Americans. General Israel Putnam derided Radière as a paper engineer who could not finish the job. Kosciuszko was sent to replace him. Today, a statue of Kosciuszko at West Point looks out over the Hudson. Washington wrote to the commander at West Point,
It will be best to order La Radière to return, especially as you say Kosciuszko is better adapted to the genius and temper of the people.
With Kosciuszko as engineer, the troops rallied behind him and built a fort to protect the chain to block British ships. But like Fort Ticonderoga, West Point had nearby hills overlooking the main fort. So Kosciuszko drafted plans for numerous smaller forts to cover the high ground. Kosciuszko bonded with Gates, who allowed slaves to enlist under their own names rather than in place of their masters.
Kosciuszko's aide-de-camp at West Point was Agrippa Hull, a free black man. Grippy, as he was known by his friends, was an incredible raconteur who told fascinating stories about his father, who he said was a prince from Africa. Kosciuszko and Grippy became very close. In fact, they built a log cabin together, which became Kosciuszko's quarters. One day, Kosciuszko came to Grippy and explained that he needed to go to the other side of the Hudson River for a few days, so he decided to have a party. He invited all the black people at West Point to the cabin and began serving them Kosciuszko's wine. Grippy decided to try on Kosciuszko's dress uniform from Poland, and all of the other black people began toasting him as, Colonel Kosciuszko, how nice of you to invite us over. Kosciuszko couldn't cross the river, so he returned the same night and walked in on the middle of the party. And Grippy fell to Kosciuszko's feet. Kosciuszko said, Rise, Prince. A prince from Africa should not prostrate himself at the feet of anyone. He took Grippy by the hand, stood him up, and walked him across West Point to where the other officers were. He introduced him as a prince from Africa who had come to join our cause. The officers decided to toast Grippy. The next day, instead of waking up with whip marks on his back, Grippy woke up with an incredible hangover.
American slavery reminded Kosciuszko of European serfdom and the struggles of his own country.
There was one place at West Point where Kosciuszko could be alone, and he built himself a garden that he carved out of the side of a cliff. It was a place where he could be alone and think about his homeland.
Poland was also facing a struggle for independence. Kosciuszko was born on February 12, 1746, to a family of gentry in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland's kings were elected by noblemen in a parliament called the Sejm. This gave aristocrats control over commoners and the peasants who farmed their land.
31 peasant families lived on the Kosciuszko family's land. These serfs worked from dawn until dusk to provide up to 6 days of slave labor, known as the corvée.
In the 17th century, Poland's Hussar Knights stretched the Commonwealth's borders from the Baltic to the Black Sea. By the time Kosciuszko was born, Poland's heyday had passed.
The bickering Polish and Lithuanian noble classes allowed the Commonwealth to devolve into a corrupt oligarchy. Other European powers took advantage of this and began to meddle in Warsaw's affairs. And in 1764, Tsarina Catherine the Great sent Russian troops into Warsaw, and she propped her former lover, Prince Stanisław Augustus Poniatowski, on the throne in Warsaw.
King Stanislaw was seen as the Tsarina's puppet. He pulled away from Russia's orbit by investing in the arts, education, and establishing a military academy. When his father died, Kosciuszko enrolled in the military academy and was its star cadet. An ambitious artist, Kosciuszko drew this portrait of his patron, Prince Adam Czartoryski.
Here at the Royal Military Academy, Kosciuszko excelled in art, math, engineering, and even swordsmanship. And he was so eager to get a jump on his studies that before he went to bed, he would tie a string to his wrist. He left the other end outside the door and asked the night watchman to pull on it at 3 a.m. to wake him.
King Stanislaw's ties with Tsarina Catherine were too close. Civil war was brewing. In 1768, a group of noblemen formed a confederacy to challenge Russia with a cavalry led by Casimir Pulaski. The king was asked to join the Confederates or abdicate.
The Bar Confederacy pitted Pole against Pole, and Kosciuszko chose not to fight his fellow countrymen. Instead, he accepted a scholarship to further his military studies in Paris.
As a foreigner, Kosciuszko could not enroll in the French military academy. Instead, he attended the Royal Academy of Painting and paid professors from the military school to tutor him privately. He created paintings such as these and drafted plans for a fort for Prince Czartoryski. In Paris, Kosciuszko read Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau. He admired a philosophy called physiocracy, developed by economist Francois Quesnay. Physiocrats saw land as the true source of wealth, and agriculture as the key to prosperity. They wanted to abolish forced labor for serfs, and laissez-faire would create free markets, individual liberty, and economic security. Physiocracy would end feudalism.
Throughout my 5 years in foreign lands, I studied in order to become proficient in economics and military matters, for which things I had a native passion, so as to discover what was necessary to attain durable government and the due happiness of all.
Kosciuszko's own pursuit of happiness proved more elusive. He returned to Poland where the Bar Confederacy had been crushed. Pulaski fled the country. Poland's neighbors took advantage of this turmoil. In 1772, Poland was attacked from 3 sides and partitioned. Russia swallowed Polish land in the east. Prussia annexed land in the west. Austria grabbed land from Poland in the south. Kosciuszko's situation was also dire. His brother Joseph had squandered their inheritance, and officer commissions had to be purchased. So, despite his extensive military training, Kosciuszko was unable to serve his country. He began tutoring the daughter of one of the richest men in Poland, Lord Sosnowski. Ludwika Sosnowski and Kosciuszko were kindred spirits who cared about freedom and equality for all. They fell in love and wanted to marry. But Lord Sosnowski scoffed at Kosciuszko's proposal. Sosnowski said,
"Pigeons are not meant for sparrows, and daughters of land magnates are not meant for sons of the common gentry."
Sosnowski's plans for Ludwika to marry Prince Joseph Lubomirski were arranged through a card game. But Kosciuszko and Ludwika ran off to elope. When Sosnowski and his guards caught them, Kosciuszko drew his sword. But he sheathed it when he saw Ludwika's father. Sosnowski's men knocked out Kosciuszko, and Ludwika was sent to a convent to await her marriage to the prince. Lord Sosnowski wanted to prosecute Kosciuszko for kidnapping, so he was forced into exile. Kosciuszko's friends at West Point knew of his tragic romance, but there were more challenges when French engineers arrived after France signed a treaty with the United States. Unhappy that Kosciuszko replaced La Radière at West Point, the French engineers tried to undermine him. Captain Louis Duportail agreed to come to America, but only if the United States jumped his rank to general. Washington needed French gunpowder, so he agreed. Duportail belittled Kosciuszko's plan to fortify Rocky Hill. He wrote to Washington,
It would be very difficult for an enemy, even when master of it, to bring a heavy cannon there. Besides, it would be too far to make a breach.
The Americans ignored Kosciuszko's plan to cover the high ground at Fort Ticonderoga. They were about to make the same mistake at West Point. Washington arrived in the nick of time. Kosciuszko gave Washington a progress report, explaining the need for additional readouts. Before, Washington spelled Kosciuszko's name 11 different ways. After this visit, he spelled it correctly. Washington said Kosciuszko was
fully competent to the business.
Washington ordered Kosciuszko's plans to be carried out.
All those soldiers who are masons by trade in the line are immediately to be drawn out and sent to the fort for a special and temporary service. They are to take their orders from Colonel Kosciuszko.
Washington called West Point
the most important post in America.
General Sinclair was appointed commander of West Point. Sinclair had faced court-martial for ignoring Kosciuszko's advice at Fort Ticonderoga and abandoning the fort. This time, Washington made sure Sinclair followed Kosciuszko's plan to cover the high ground. Rocky Hill was a priority. Washington wrote to Sinclair,
This hill appears to me essential to the preservation of the whole post, and our main effort ought to be directed to keeping the enemy off of it. Make yourself master of its defense. You will have an eye to the works to be erected to hasten their completion.
Redoubt number 4 was the key. Today, it overlooks the Kosciuszko Monument at West Point. After 2 years of construction detail, Kosciuszko begged Washington to send him back into battle. Washington resisted. That changed when General Duportail was captured in South Carolina. Washington transferred Kosciuszko to the south and reassigned Benedict Arnold to West Point. But Arnold was plotting the most infamous act of treason in American history. For weeks, Arnold had been scheming to hand over West Point to the British. Redoubt number 4 was the way in. Kosciuszko had left a chest full of plans for West Point with the innkeeper, Mrs. Sarah Warren, for safekeeping. These drawings provided a secret road map of West Point. In British hands, they would end the American Revolution. Arnold ordered a French engineer, Major Villefranche, to recreate a map of Kosciuszko's forts and redoubts. With West Point under his command, Arnold began to sabotage Kosciuszko's work. Arnold had a link removed from the iron chain across the Hudson. If the British could take redoubt number 4, the other forts would fall like dominoes. Kosciuszko planned for 200 men to be stationed at redoubt number 4 on Rocky Hill. But on September 5th, 1780, Arnold canceled this order, saying that,
In case of alarm, only a non-commissioned officer and 3 men are needed there.
Arnold wrote to the British spy, Major John Andre.
The height's called Rocky Hill, which commands all the other works, is about half a mile from Fort Putnam. There is a small redoubt to hold 200 men and 2 6-pounders pointed on the other works. The wall is 6 feet thick and defenseless on the back. The English may land 3 miles below and have a good road to bring up heavy cannon to Rocky Hill.
Arnold gave Andre a map of Kosciuszko's fortifications and instructions for capturing them. He also gave Andre a pass to cross enemy lines. On September 23, 1780, Andre was caught at a checkpoint with the secret documents hidden in his boot. The next morning, Arnold was reading dispatches. One message, meant for Washington, was sent to Arnold by mistake. Andre had been arrested. Benedict Arnold's treasonous plot to sell Kosciuszko's plans for West Point to the British was exposed. Arnold rushed upstairs to alert his wife. Washington's aide arrived to announce that the commander-in-chief was on his way. Arnold jumped on his horse and rode to the river, where he made his way to the British warship, the HMS Vulture. Washington wanted to make sure Kosciuszko's plans were secured and wrote to General William Heath.
I am informed of a chest belonging to Colonel Kosciuszko, containing principally papers of a public nature, which General Greene determined to remove from Mrs. Warren's to a place of more security. If the chest still remains at West Point, you will take it into your charge, or have it removed to a place of safety.
Terrified that the British would come for Kosciuszko's papers, Mrs. Warren burned them all so that they would not fall into enemy hands. When Arnold's plot was uncovered, Kosciuszko was in Virginia, where he met with Governor Thomas Jefferson to discuss troop movements. General Nathaniel Greene was commanding officer in the South, and Kosciuszko was put in charge of building flat-bottomed boats that could be carried from river to land. The British chased Greene's army in a 200-mile race across the South in a game of cat and mouse.
Kosciuszko appeared to be everywhere, handling the myriads of details necessary for success, planning lines of march, gathering and dispatching crucial boats, and seeking little shortcuts known to no one but the local farmers.
Traveling through southern swamps, the troops ate frogs and alligators. Always ready to run, the Americans held the reins of their horses with one hand while cooking bacon on a stick with the other. Battles such as Guilford Courthouse were bloody for both sides. General Greene wrote, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." While Greene and Kosciuszko fought the British in the Carolinas, in Virginia, the Battle of Yorktown crushed the main British army. Washington accepted the surrender of Lord Cornwallis and 9,000 British and German troops. But in South Carolina, the English held out. Greene and Kosciuszko spent the next year attacking the British every chance they got. As field commander in charge of surrounding the British in Charleston, Kosciuszko developed a network of black spies to give him locations of British troops. The Polish commander starved the enemy by driving cattle, sheep, and hogs behind Continental Army lines. On November 13, 1782, a slave told Kosciuszko the British would be on James Island at daybreak. Kosciuszko and 60 American soldiers attacked 300 redcoats. Four musket balls pierced Kosciuszko's coat, but he escaped unhurt. It was the last skirmish of the war on American soil. Kosciuszko and General Greene marched into Charleston on December 14, 1782. Greene wrote to Congress saying that Kosciuszko's zeal and activity had been equaled by few and exceeded by none. Washington recommended to Congress that Kosciuszko be promoted to general. Kosciuszko returned to Philadelphia. He had been in the Continental Army longer than any other foreign officer, yet he had never been paid. Congress was still unable to pay his back salary, but asked him to prepare a fireworks display on July 4, 1783. It was the first Independence Day celebrating the end of the war. Congress finally made the Polish engineer a brigadier general in the United States Army on October 13, 1783. Washington gave Kosciuszko 2 pistols and a sword with the Latin engraving, "America and Washington are joined with our friend T. Kosciuszko." When Washington bid farewell to his officers at Francis Tavern, Kosciuszko was among the honored guests.
When it was Kosciuszko's turn, Washington pulled off a cameo ring given to him as a member of the Society of the Cincinnati and slid it onto Kosciuszko's finger.
Teary-eyed, Washington raised a glass of wine, took a drink, and said,
"I cannot come to each of you to take my leave, but shall be obliged if each of you will come and take me by the hand."
The cameo bore the image of a Roman farmer, Lucius Cincinnatus, who led an army against foreign invaders.
In a sense, this was a symbolic transfer of authority from one general who led his nation to independence to another who would lead his nation against foreign invaders, again in the name of liberty.
Because Congress owed him for 7.5 years in back salary as a Continental officer, Kosciuszko was broke and unable to return home. Congress gave Kosciuszko a certificate for $12,280 to be cashed in at a later date. Kosciuszko befriended Chaim Solomon, a Jewish Pole who came to America in 1775. Solomon was a currency trader and one of the principal financiers of the American Revolution. He subsidized the careers of officers and founding fathers James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Solomon gave Kosciuszko $142, allowing the Pole to return to Europe. While Kosciuszko was Catholic, he had a close relationship with Poland's Jews. Jews began immigrating to Poland after the year 1264, when the General Charter of Jewish Liberties guaranteed them protection. It allowed them to create their own Yiddish-speaking state within a state. Given a safe haven, Jews established villages and governed themselves. Jewish craftsmen and merchants became Poland's middle class. In 1784, Kosciuszko returned to a Poland in turmoil. Prince Czartoryski was arguing with King Stanislaw over political reforms. Kosciuszko's beloved Ludwika had married Prince Lubomirski and had 3 children. The hero of the American Revolution returned to his farm to live as a gentleman farmer. The changes in the New World stirred revolution in France and Poland. Kosciuszko made his opinions on slavery and serfdom known to all.
Serfdom is a word that must be cursed by all enlightened nations.
Many Poles agreed with him. In 1787, the Polish parliament began drafting a constitution to establish a new system of government. The debate had far-reaching implications for the legal status of burghers, peasants, and Jews. In May 1789, Princess Ludwika advised Kosciuszko to return to the Polish capital because the Sejm was about to commission officers for the new army.
As your best girlfriend, I advise you to make sure that you will be in Warsaw, because those who are not present don't have the right. Please believe that no one under the sun has a more real and intense interest in your fate than I do. I cannot think about you without a certain movement within my heart and soul. It's quite clear. My soul is not ungrateful that you were the first one to unravel my feelings of love and tenderness. Your misery is always alive in me, and I want, with my own luck, to buy your happiness and satisfaction.
Ludwika told Kosciuszko that his name came up in a conversation with the king. The sly princess also wrote to King Stanislaw.
Your Majesty is well aware of this relationship long ago between myself and Kosciuszko. In America, he served honorably as a professional, and if he served so eagerly for foreigners, imagine how useful he will be to his own fatherland. I ask your highness for leniency if my appeal seems too audacious, and I keep my lips sealed.
Kosciuszko took Ludwika's advice and traveled to Warsaw to apply for a post in the army. While in the capital, Kosciuszko saw Ludwika at a ball. The chance meeting was so emotional they could not even speak. Ludwika's appeal persuaded the king to enlist Kosciuszko as a general in the Polish army. Kosciuszko's real service to Poland was just beginning.
On May 3rd, 1791, the Poles passed the first written democratic constitution in Europe. It provided a form of habeas corpus, more rights for the burgher classes and the Jews, and gave amnesty to peasants from other countries that fled to Poland.
There's no doubt in my mind that it was accelerated by the romance, the attraction, the mystery, the idealism of the French Revolution, and that helped to inspire the Poles to do something that no other European country had then yet done, and gives Poland really genuine, important democratic credentials.
When news of the Polish Constitution reached America, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson praised it. Thomas Paine was so pleased that he considered applying for Polish citizenship. Russian Tsarina Catherine was furious. She summoned Poland's ambassador to her palace and screamed.
What a constitution! Being surrounded by 3 powerful neighbors to declare freedom from peasants who come to Poland? What an idea! That will lure most of the peasants of Belarus to Poland, and the rest of my serfs will dilly-dally.
Prussia's king was also angry. The advent of the Industrial Revolution meant new opportunities for the burgher class. The Polish constitution gave burghers more freedom. Prussian manufacturers would set up shop in Poland. Prussia and Russia invaded Poland to squash the democratic reforms. Kosciuszko said Poland needed militias like the American Minutemen. Kosciuszko said that if Jews and peasants were given legal status, they would gladly send recruits because
they would be fighting for their own property, legal rights, and happiness.
Kosciuszko wanted all classes to join the militia. Just as American plantation owners did not want to arm black slaves, Poland's land magnates did not want to arm oppressed serfs. The king ignored Kosciuszko's idea for a citizens' militia. The war to defend the May 3rd Constitution was a disaster. Although the 44-year-old Kosciuszko was the only general with real battle experience, the king named his 26-year-old nephew, Prince Joseph Poniatowski, as commander of the army. On the battlefield, he was no match for Russia's battle-tested generals and retreated from the front. In a village called Dubienka, Kosciuszko made a stand against an army of 25,000 Russians, 5 times the size of his regiment. Russian cannons bombarded the Poles from all sides. Kosciuszko was forced to retreat. 900 Poles died, and 5,000 Russians were killed. King Stanislaw surrendered. Russia annexed more Polish land in the east. Prussia partitioned more Polish territory in the west. Kosciuszko once again had to flee his country. France offered help to all nations seeking freedom. The Poles were enamored with the French rhetoric of a worldwide struggle for liberté, égalité, fraternité. Kosciuszko arrived in Paris on January 21st, 1793, the day that French King Louis XVI was beheaded. Kosciuszko was disgusted with bloodthirsty mob justice and said that Poland would not have a French revolution. The Poles persuaded Kosciuszko to come home. He snuck into Poland to meet with rebels in Krakow. Krakow was surrounded by a moat and granite wall 8 feet wide and 20 feet tall. It had 39 towers and 8 gates with drawbridges. The steeple of St. Mary's Church was a lookout over the nearby hills. A bugler blew his horn when the gates were closed at dusk. Kosciuszko walked across a drawbridge, leading a single horse pulling a wagon with his uniform and weapons. On March 24th, 1794, a revolutionary council met in Krakow to appoint Kosciuszko commander-in-chief of the nation. As he was sworn in, Kosciuszko said he wanted all of society to be equal.
Honorable sirs, in defense of the fatherland, equality will prosper in my eyes. Jews, peasants, aristocrats, priests, and burghers have equal respect from me, and the many citizens and land magnates that have been invited to participate in today's events.
After being named commander-in-chief, Thaddeus Kosciuszko came in here to this beautiful old synagogue to meet Rabbi Hirsch David Levy and ask him and Jewish community in Krakow for their support.
Kosciuszko promised the Jewish community to address their grievances, such as unfair taxes. Poland's Jews supported the democratic movement. And in some areas of Poland, as much as 20% of the army was Jewish. Kosciuszko also enlisted peasants who took scythes for harvesting wheat and bent the blades forward to create lances. On April 4th, 1794, the Tsarina's troops attacked the Poles near Ratsławice. The Russians opened fire with 12 cannons, dispersing the Polish cavalry. Kosciuszko led a charge of 300 peasants directly at the Russian cannons. A serf named Bartosz reached the Russian batteries and extinguished a sparkling cannon fuse with his hat. Other serfs followed. The Russians were stunned as peasants hacked away at them with farming tools, slicing and killing 600. The Tsarina's bloodied army fled, leaving 12 cannons on the battlefield. Kosciuszko ripped off his uniform and put on a sukmana, a peasant robe made of wool. The serfs roared in approval as their peasant prince declared that the scythemen would be a separate branch of Poland's military. The serf Bartosz was given his freedom and dubbed Duke Glowacki. The cannons were taken to Krakow, and Kosciuszko's army marched toward Warsaw. On May 7, 1794, nearly 70 years before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, Kosciuszko issued the Polaniec Proclamation, freeing the serfs and granting them civil liberties. Kosciuszko appealed to the Russian Orthodox clergy.
Join your hearts with the Poles who defend our freedom and yours.
The phrase was turned around and, for your freedom and ours, became Poland's battle cry. In Warsaw, soldiers, peasants, Jews, and burghers joined Kosciuszko. A shoemaker named Jan Kalinski formed a militia to join the ragtag army. Kosciuszko's aide-de-camp was a black man named Jean Lapierre. While black men were enslaved in America, Lapierre fought to free the white serfs of Europe. Kosciuszko's rebels published a paper called the Government Gazette to report on the uprising. The citizen army dug in. On July 1794, the Russian and Prussian armies surrounded Warsaw. Diplomats from Austria and Sweden wrote to inform their kings that this rebellion was different because even Jews were taking up arms to defend Poland.
Berek Yoselevich was a Jewish merchant who formed the first Jewish brigade since biblical time. And he approached Kosciuszko and he says, Kosciuszko is a messenger from God Almighty. That's why the Jewish people who should support him should fight for him like lions and leopards.
Furious with the multicultural, democratic movement, the Russian Tsarina sent her most ruthless general, Alexander Suvorov, to crush the uprising. She offered a reward for Kosciuszko's capture, dead or alive. With Suvorov marching into Poland, Kosciuszko raced from Warsaw to the front lines. A large Russian army overwhelmed the Poles at the Battle of Maciejowice. Kosciuszko had a pike driven into his back. Another spear punctured his sciatic nerve. As he lay bleeding in the mud, the Russians could not find him. They searched for a commander in a fancy uniform. Kosciuszko was wearing his peasant robe. When they found him, Kosciuszko was sent to Russia with his black aide, Jean Lapierre. Russia, Prussia, and Austria divvied up the Commonwealth's territory. Poland was wiped off the map. Kosciuszko spent the next 2 years imprisoned in Russia. When Tsarina Catherine died in 1796, her son, Tsar Paul, offered Kosciuszko his freedom. But he had to swear allegiance to Russia. It was the only way to secure the release of the 12,000 Polish prisoners of war in Siberia. Tsar Paul gave Kosciuszko 60,000 rubles and a fur coat for his journey across Scandinavia. The Pole hated that coat from the Tsar of Russia. When he returned to Philadelphia, Kosciuszko gave it to his friend Thomas Jefferson, who admired it. He even posed in it for his official portrait. The third president is depicted in that fur in the Jefferson Memorial.
Jefferson and Kosciuszko formed a lifelong bond, a bond of friendship, of intellectual comradeship. When they saw each other, it was almost as if they were made for each other.
Jefferson often visited Kosciuszko in his room on 3rd Street and Pine. They discussed politics, the French Revolution, and the topic that was most infuriating to Kosciuszko, slavery. Kosciuszko could not understand how the author of the phrase, "all men are created equal," could own slaves. Kosciuszko confided in Jefferson that he wanted to return to Europe to free Poland and end serfdom. But he was still unable to walk. Kosciuszko also spoke up for the rights of Native Americans. He was shocked that Americans were killing their indigenous tribes. The Pole was pleased by a visit from Chief Little Turtle of the Miami Indian tribe, who brought him a combination tomahawk and peace pipe as a sign of gratitude. In return, Kosciuszko gave the chief his eyeglasses and his jacket. He also gave Little Turtle 2 pistols and said,
"These pistols I have carried and used on many hard-fought battlefields in defense of the oppressed, the weak, the wronged of my own race. I now present them to you with the injunction that with them you shoot dead the first man who ever comes to subjugate you or to despoil you of your country."
Washington invited Kosciuszko to Mount Vernon.
Informed of your safe arrival in America, I was on the point of writing you a congratulatory letter on the occasion, welcoming you to the land whose liberties you had been so instrumental in establishing. No one has a higher respect and veneration for your character than I have.
Washington also wished Kosciuszko success in his struggle to free Poland. But the Pole was not able to make the long carriage trip to Virginia. Congress finally awarded Kosciuszko more than $17,000 in back pay and interest for his salary in the Continental Army. Kosciuszko used the money to make a statement about slavery. He wrote a last will and testament and made Jefferson the executor of his estate. In Kosciuszko's last will, he wrote,
"I beg Mr. Jefferson that in case I should die without will or testament, he should buy out of my money so many Negroes and free them, that the remaining sum should be sufficient to give them education and provide for their maintenance.
Kosciuszko wrote that each of these black men
must be married and have 100 acres of land with instruments, cattle for tillage, and know how to manage and govern it as well.
Kosciuszko wanted not only money go to emancipate the enslaved people, but to provide them with land and cattle and tools, and money that would enable them to get an education, pass that on to their children, and become true citizens of the American Republic.
Having left his American estate to free slaves, Kosciuszko decided to secretly return to Europe. A quasi-war had broken out between the United States and France. The French seized American merchant ships trading with England. Jefferson sent Kosciuszko on a secret mission to Paris to rescue the kidnapped American seamen. At 4 a.m. on May 5, 1798, Jefferson arrived at the boarding house on Pine Street to take Kosciuszko to the docks to sail for France. The vice president arranged for a fake passport so that Kosciuszko could travel under an assumed name. Russian spies kept their eyes on Kosciuszko's movements. In Paris, Kosciuszko helped to persuade the French to release the American sailors. He also plotted to free Poland. When Napoleon returned to Paris from his expedition in Egypt, he met with Kosciuszko, saying,
"I urgently wanted to meet the hero of the North."
Kosciuszko replied,
"And I am happy to see the conqueror of Europe and the hero of the East."
But Kosciuszko soon realized that Napoleon was a tyrant. The Polish general told the French revolutionaries,
"Keep a sharp eye on that young man. He might spoil your arrangement."
3 weeks later, Napoleon staged a coup d'etat, declaring himself Emperor of France. The French dictator asked Kosciuszko to help him attack Russia, but the Pole called Napoleon
the grave digger of the Republic.
While many Poles joined Napoleon's doomed invasion of Russia, Kosciuszko refused to serve under a tyrant.
After Kosciuszko left Philadelphia in May of 1798, he kept up a correspondence with Jefferson, and that went right up to within a couple of months of Kosciuszko's death in late 1817. And the last letters are enough to moisten your eyes, I would say. Jefferson said to Kosciuszko in one of the last letters, "Come and live out your life in the land of liberty. Come stay with me at Monticello. Come, you will be buried in the Monticello cemetery with me."
In his letters to Jefferson, Kosciuszko recommended that the Americans establish a military academy to train officers. As president, Jefferson did just that. He signed legislation creating the United States Military Academy at West Point, the fortress designed by Kosciuszko. The Polish commander spent his final years in exile, first on a farm in Burville, south of Paris, and later in Solothurn, Switzerland. Despite Jefferson's invitation to come live at Monticello at the age of 71, Kosciuszko did not want to cross the Atlantic again.
In his last letter to Jefferson, he said, "But please remember the final destination for my will," meaning please remember that my will provided for you to free the slaves at Monticello, or, as the word went, others of your choice.
On October 15, 1817, less than 1 month after that last letter to Jefferson, Kosciuszko died in Switzerland. With him died his wish that his money be used to free slaves.
You can search high and low among dozens of biographies of Jefferson and hardly find a trace of this friendship between these two men and this extraordinary will. Jefferson could not abide the notion of being thought badly of by his Virginia friends, the landowning, slave-owning aristocracy of Virginia. He would rather betray Kosciuszko than betray his class allies.
Lawsuits followed after several parties on both sides of the Atlantic made claims on the estate. Sadly, most of Kosciuszko's funds in America were embezzled. The Supreme Court ruled in 1852 that Kosciuszko's will was invalid. A decade later, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War. In 1908, Israel White, editor of the Newark Evening News, wrote, "This will is an unwritten chapter in American history. It is possible that if its suggestions had been followed, there might have been no civil war in the United States, and the race problem of today would not be so perplexing." In 1910, the African-American educator Booker T. Washington visited Krakow. He wrote, "I knew from my school history what Kosciuszko had done for America in its early struggle for independence. I did not know, however, what Kosciuszko had done for the freedom and education of my own people. When I visited the tomb of Kosciuszko, I placed a rose on it in the name of my race." But in modern times, most American historians and Jefferson biographers have ignored Kosciuszko's will to free slaves. Kosciuszko was a visionary ahead of his time. To some, Kosciuszko's ideals are still ahead of their time.
Just look at the front pages of the newspaper and see what's happening around the world. People are killing each other all over the place because they have something against someone, because they are not prepared to accept diversity. Kosciuszko is like other heroic, historic figures. It's a kind of evanescent presence.
While Jefferson biographers and American historians have yet to fully acknowledge Kosciuszko's legacy, the cadets at West Point are learning to live by Kosciuszko's motto, "For your freedom and ours."